Ever feel like you're totally on fire? Like just totally locked in. Ideas just flowing. The rest of the world is just gone. You know, that's that magical flow state that I think we're all kind of chasing after. But if you ever like stop to think what's actually happening in our brains when we hit that productivity sweet spot, you know, or on the flip side, what's going on when our focus feels more like a flickering light bulb? You know, today we're going beyond just those subjective feelings and like diving deep into the fascinating neuroscience of attention.
Yeah. Today we're actually dissecting a really cool 2024 study from the journal Cognitive, Affective, and Behavioral Neuroscience. Now, the title is a bit of a mouthful. Time-varying functional connectivity predicts fluctuations in sustained attention in a serial tapping task.
Yeah.
But trust me, the way they uncovered these findings is really interesting. And what it reveals about how our brains work is even cooler.
Okay. So hit me with the spark notes here. What were they actually studying?
So they were looking at how different brain networks, you know, those interconnected highways of neurons in our brains, either work together or clash to impact our focus.
Okay.
And to do this, they had people do a simple finger tapping task while they were inside a brain scanner.
Finger tapping. Okay, I'm not gonna lie, that sounds kind of basic. Like, what's so special about that?
It's all in the nuances. So our attention, it's not this like constant thing. It fluctuates like a flickering flame, you know? And these researchers, they were interested in like the really, really tiny millisecond variations in timing during this tapping.
Okay.
And these tiny shifts actually revealed when someone was in a high focus in the zone state versus when their attention was about to like totally crash and burn.
Oh, interesting. So they were basically measuring those moments when we're like completely on fire, nailing every beat, compared to when we're more likely to like totally stumble and lose our place.
Precisely. And they didn't stop at just observing this behavior. They wanted to see what was happening inside the brain during these attentional peaks and valleys. And that's where the fMRI comes in.
The fMRI. Now that's where we get to like peek inside the brain, right? Give us the inside scoop on this tech.
Absolutely. So imagine an incredibly detailed 3D map of your brain with all of its intricate networks lit up like a constellation.
Okay.
fMRI allows us to observe this in real time, capturing those split-second changes in how different regions of your brain are communicating with each other.
Whoa. So using this fMRI, they could actually see which parts of the brain were like lighting up when someone was super focused versus when their mind started to wander.
Exactly. They were particularly interested in 4 major brain networks that constantly interact to shape our attention: the default mode network, or DMN, the dorsal attention network, or DAN, the ventral attention network, which is VAN, and lastly, the frontoparietal control network, or FPCN.
Okay, wow. That's a lot of acronyms to throw out there.
Yeah.
Can we like break those down a little bit? What is each of these networks actually responsible for? Let's start with the DMN. What is that?
Sure. So think of the default mode network, the DMN, as your brain's inner daydreamer. It's the network that's most active when your mind is wandering, reminiscing, or even just lost in thought.
Okay, so the DMN, that's the part of my brain that's like composing my grocery list when I should be focusing on this podcast, right?
Exactly. And while it can be a major distraction culprit, it is essential for things like self-reflection and creativity. It's not all bad.
Right. Okay. Well, then what about the dorsal attention network, the DAN? Where does that one fit into all of this?
So the DAN is all about that laser focus on the outside world, zeroing in on whatever task is at hand.
Okay, gotcha. So it's like our brain's spotlight illuminating whatever needs our immediate attention. What about the VAN, though?
Ah, yes. The ventral attention network acts like your brain's alarm system. It's constantly scanning for anything novel or important in your surroundings.
Interesting.
And if it picks up on something significant, it'll alert the DAN, hey, you might want to check this out.
I like it. It's like the trusty sidekick, always on the lookout. Okay, so we've got our daydreaming DMN, our focused DAN, and our vigilant VAN. That leaves us with the FPCN. What's that one all about?
So the FPCN, the frontoparietal control network, is essentially your brain's executive control center. It's responsible for things like planning, decision-making, and regulating your attention. Think of it like the conductor of an orchestra, making sure all the different sections are playing in sync.
Okay, gotcha. So we've got our 4 key players here: the daydreaming DMN, the focused DAN, the vigilant VAN, and our masterful FTCN. But how did the researchers actually connect the dots between these networks and those in-the-zone moments?
Well, remember how we talked about how they pinpointed those high-focus states based on the consistency of the finger tapping?
Right, yeah.
They discovered that these moments of peak performance were actually correlated with a really fascinating pattern of brain activity.
Ooh, okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Tell me more.
So during these high-focus states, they found that the DMN, our inner chatterbox, was essentially off doing its own thing.
Oh, great.
Like if you imagine a musician just wandering off for a solo while the rest of the orchestra keeps playing.
Okay, so the DMN was like taking a break, letting the more focused parts of the brain take center stage.
Exactly. The DMN and those task-focused networks, like Dan, were completely out of sync, barely even talking to each other. It seems like when we're really deeply immersed in something, those two networks, they kind of operate almost independently.
That makes sense. No wonder we can lose track of time and get so much done when we're truly in the zone. It's like all the distractions in our brain have just decided to take a coffee break at the same time. But what about when our focus starts to waver? Did the researchers see that in the brain activity too?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. As people's attention would drift and their tapping got more erratic, the communication patterns in the brain totally shifted.
Yeah.
The DMN and the DAN, they started chatting again like nothing had ever happened.
Uh-oh. Back to the party. So that's when we get that feeling of our brain getting foggy, like we can't quite grasp the task at hand anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where the FPCN, our maestro, really comes into play. When we're laser focused, the FPCN is working hard in the background, helping to maintain that state by coordinating with those other task-oriented networks, like the DAN, for example.
So the FPCN is basically like the bouncer for our brains, making sure that the DMN stays backstage and lets the focus networks have the spotlight.
Precisely. But here's where things get even more interesting. When our attention starts to drift, the FPCN can actually get pulled in by the DMN.
Oh, no.
It's like the conductor getting distracted by a rogue flute player.
And that's when we fall out of the flow state and right back into distraction.
That makes so much sense. Knowing all of this, though, is there anything we can actually do to train our brains to stay in that focused zone for longer,
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And while this study mostly focused on just understanding these attentional fluctuations, it does hint at some pretty fascinating possibilities. For example, since we know distractions can activate the DMN, minimizing those external interruptions becomes even more important.
So turning off those social media notifications.
Yeah.
And maybe telling our housemates that we're in the zone for a bit could actually make a difference.
Absolutely. Every time we switch our attention, we're essentially forcing our FPCN to slam on the brakes and make a U-turn.
And those constant shifts, they're exhausting. They make it so much harder to maintain that deep flow state. Creating a calm and distraction-free environment can work wonders.
Yeah, it's like giving our FPCN a clear roadmap instead of forcing it to navigate a million detours. This is also fascinating. But this study looked at, those short-term shifts in attention. Does this research tell us anything about how to improve our focus long-term?
That's a great question, and it's something that researchers are super actively exploring right now. There's promising evidence suggesting that we can actually train our brains to become more attentive over time.
Wait, really? So you're saying our brains can actually get better at focusing? Tell me more.
It's like we're building mental muscle.
Yeah.
The more we challenge our brains to focus, the stronger those neural pathways become.
Oh, I like that. So it's like taking our FPCN to the gym. Gotta love that. But I'm also thinking here, this in the zone state sounds amazing and all, but is it really realistic to strive for that level of focus all the time? Our brains weren't designed for constant, unwavering attention, were they?
You're absolutely right. And this study brings up a really important point that I think often gets kind of overlooked in our, super productivity-obsessed world. While being in the zone is definitely valuable, those moments when our minds are just allowed to wander freely, those are crucial too.
So we're not just giving ourselves permission to daydream. We're actually acknowledging that it serves a purpose. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Well, think about it. When our minds are wandering, that's often when we have those aha moments, when we connect those seemingly totally unrelated ideas, or we finally come up with that creative solution to a problem that's been bugging us.
Right.
When the DMN is in the driver's seat, it can sometimes lead us down those unexpected and often really fruitful paths.
It's like our unconscious mind needs a little space to work its magic, to process information and make those serendipitous connections that we can't always consciously force.
Exactly. It's not about being on or off all the time. It's about finding that sweet spot, that dynamic balance between that really focused attention and allowing our minds to wander a bit when it's most beneficial.
This reminds me of something you mentioned earlier about the DMN being really active during creative thinking. So instead of trying to shut down our DMN completely, could we actually try to guide our daydreams in a more productive direction?
That's a fascinating question, and honestly, a really promising area of research. Imagine if we could actually harness the power of the DMN. You know, we set an intention for that downtime, and then we let our minds just explore all the possibilities within that specific realm.
So instead of just telling my DMN to be quiet,
Right.
it's more like I'm giving it like a creative assignment. I'm like, okay, brain, I need some fresh ideas for this project. Go wild, but come back with something brilliant.
Exactly. You're collaborating with your DMN, recognizing its strengths, and learning how to channel its power more effectively.
This has been such an eye-opening deep dive, honestly. It's totally changed how I think about focus and those moments when my mind just feels completely scattered. I think the biggest takeaway for me is that attention. It's not just this on or off switch, you know? It's about understanding that really dynamic dance between these different brain networks and learning how to leverage each of them more effectively in our everyday lives.
Beautifully put. It's about embracing the power of both that focused spotlight of the DN and the meandering exploration of the DMN. Working together, they help us navigate our world and achieve some pretty amazing things.
And on that note, we'll leave you to navigate your own neural pathways. Hopefully a little more in the zone and a lot more appreciative of that intricate dance that's happening inside your brain every single second. Until next time, happy focus.